For some reason, I thought you guys were in the city. I thought you were like New York City area, but
Michelle.
not too
So
far.
I'm from Long Island, and she still lives on Long Island.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where on the island are you guys from?
I'm from Port Jeff, and she lives like Center Reach area.
Okay. I'm not too familiar with the island, but I grew up in Westchester. So
Oh, okay, cool.
we're, yeah, nice. I feel like you're the first outside of like my like immediate friends. You're like the first New Yorker that I've had on the show, which is fun. That's
Yeah,
also the
very
cool
cool.
thing about doing this is like you like, you know, meet people on Twitter or whatever, and you get to like chat with people from all over the country, all over the world. Like,
Yeah. It's very, everyone loves to complain, and I think that there are people with legitimate concerns and complaints about social media. But if you're lucky and you use it correctly, it's a really amazing tool, especially for hobbies or niche conversations, or putting shows on like this. You can connect with people from all over the world. And yeah, I mean, there's people that I talk to now every day and have for the last several years that are all over the country. And yeah, it's great.
it's sweet. It's yeah, like you're saying, if you use the platforms like the way that they should be used, they can be a really cool tool to connecting with people who you otherwise wouldn't connect with.
Yeah.
I think it's awesome. Like a lot, there are so many things to complain about with respects to Twitter and what it's become, but I still think that there are a lot of really good uses for it. You know, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation now
Yeah,
if it weren't for
absolutely.
Twitter. You
Yeah.
know, I have seen you using the platform, and I thought to myself, this guy seems really cool. He seems, pretty chill. He has some good movie takes. I would love to talk to him. In front of microphones and just shoot the shit about movies. So yeah, so here we are. Screenagers, we're back with another episode of the Canon. That lovely voice that you're hearing is Seth Vargas, the co-host of the Movie Friends podcast. We're here today to talk about Francis Ford Coppola's The Outsiders, a movie that I hadn't seen until preparing for this episode. So I am very excited to talk about that movie. But Seth, welcome to the show. How's it going? Thanks for being on.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here. Always excited to talk about The Outsiders, and it's going good. It's going good.
So before we get into the movie itself, like I said, you're the co-host of the Movie Friends podcast, which is a great podcast. I've been able to listen to a few episodes, but for those who haven't been able to listen to it yet, why don't you just sort of walk us through the basic idea for the show and just what people could expect, listening to it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of film podcasts out there, as you know, if you're listening to this. And what I found was that a lot of them are geared towards being angry, being right, being very arrogant, and putting people down or putting movies down. And, one of my favorite film podcasts is We Hate Movies, right? And that's all about hating on bad movies, but they're also very funny, talented people who put that
Yeah.
on. And I think that their show, along with the Nostalgia Critic and other big YouTubers and podcasters, I think that people kind of took that idea and ran with it, but they're not talented and they're not funny. And so the shows just come across as being like angry, mean jerks. So
Yeah.
my friend Michelle, she's been podcasting since like 2009, and
Oh, wow.
she has her own network, very successful, and they mostly
That's
do
awesome. She
television.
was early in the game. Yeah.
Yeah. And so she knows all about podcasting, and I knew a lot about movies. And legit, like when we started, she had seen, this sounds like an exaggeration, but like maybe 200 movies in her entire life, which that sounds like a lot. But when you start asking about actually specific movies, you're like, oh, wow, that really isn't a lot. And so we kind of had this opportunity where we could put the two areas of expertise together. And so the reason it's called Movie Friends is because most people who are into movies, right? They are like the movie guy or the movie friend in people's lives. Like everyone has that one coworker who knows a lot about movies. And so you talk to that person, right?
Yeah.
So we wanted to kind of be that for people on the internet who maybe you really love movies and you want to have somebody to talk about it with, and it's not, we're not trying to like talk down to you or say, oh, you've never seen The Godfather? That's ridiculous. Because guess what? One of our co-hosts is watching it for the first time, you know? So it's, yeah, I know that that's an extremely long explanation of the show, but there's multiple layers as to why it came about
Yeah.
and what the kind of drive behind it is. We both love talking to people. And so we wanted to
Mhm.
put friends like right in the title. And the structure of our show is very like audience based. We get a lot of feedback from people like on Twitter, emails. For our Patreon, we have a patron only Discord. We're really trying to like grow a community of people and like talk to people. We have guests on a lot, and yeah, we're interested in making it like a social interactive thing.
I love that. I love so much about it. Listening to the show, you can tell that the two of you have built a really cool community of people who want to talk about movies and want to talk about movies in a way that's not douchey, negative, arrogant, like all of those like mean spirited
Yeah.
sort of words that
Yeah.
you were using before, which it's so easy to find a lot of that in
Yeah.
internet movie review culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's something that is super personal to me, and this show, I really wanted to make something that is celebrating movies. Like
Yeah.
everyone who's online and has a movie podcast or a movie YouTube channel or whatever it may be is writing reviews. We got into movies for a reason. And we
Yes.
should remind ourselves that that reason is because movies are super rad
Yeah.
and we should celebrate them being rad.
Yeah.
So I love that you guys have just like a super positive show. It's not, you guys don't talk down to your audience at all. You really do include them in the show that they're making, which is like the best kind of podcast community to be a part of, where you're listening but you also feel like you are part of the show that is being made. So
Yeah.
I absolutely love what you guys are doing over there.
Hey, thank you very much.
How long have you and Michelle known each other? Is this your first podcast together? Because you guys,
Yeah.
like, it, like listening to you guys, the banter and the back and forth is so easy. It's like it's so seamless.
Yeah, so we just came up with like a new tagline for the show, which is also extremely long-winded, which is Michelle has been podcasting forever, Seth has been watching movies forever, and they've been friends forever. So we've known each other for probably at this point like 20 years, over 20 years, something crazy like that. So, yeah, and this is the first show we've done. I've pitched so many shows to her over the years, and she's always been like, yeah, okay, yeah, all right, all right. And this was the first one that she was like, yeah, we should do this one. And then off of the main show, on our Patreon, we have, which I swear none of this is a commercial. If you're listening to this, I don't want your money. I don't know who you are. Leave me alone, okay? But we do,
But you should go check
um,
out the show.
we do a lot of bonus stuff. Like we just started a new show covering episodes of the TV show Seventh Heaven. We do, we've been going over a year now doing every episode of the show Freaks and Geeks. We did a Studio
Nice.
Ghibli show where we were watching all the movies from
Hmm.
that. So there's a lot of like offshoots to the main show that we do.
So this is your first podcast that you've been doing.
Yes. Yep.
I wouldn't be able to tell. I feel like
Oh, thanks.
you guys you guys are truly great. And I know you said that we're not doing a commercial for the show, but
Yeah,
I
I
do
don't
think
want them
that
to listen. All right. If you're listening to this, forget my name, forget the show's name. All right. Don't listen.
I think anyone who's listening to this will also enjoy your show. I think most people have room for 2 movie podcasts in their lives.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
so.
I
I
usually
don't know.
juggle
It's
between like 8 and 12, so
yeah, it's like all I consume. Well, that's cool. So I think you guys did a live recording, like a meet and greet sort of episode recently. What
yeah,
was
yeah.
that like? That sounds super cool.
It was so stressful. It was really crazy. We made our goals for the show, and like I said, Michelle has been podcasting since 2009, right? So what is that, like 14, almost 15 years? And she's like, one of my goals is to do a live show. I've never done one, and I would really like to do one. And so I said, well, that's what we're doing. If anyone comes or if they don't come, that's what we're gonna. So we did one for our first year anniversary in January. We covered Shrek 2, and we wanted to do a movie that was
Classic.
fun and lively and that most people had seen, and we could make
Yeah.
jokes about. Like, I was like, we can't do The Godfather 2 and expect it to be like something that people are going to travel for. So yeah, like we just kind of made it like a variety show. Like, we wrote bits, and we had like a lot of like visual gags, and so like the episode doesn't
Mhm.
translate that well to like an audio episode, but we were like, we don't care, we're renting out a theater for this, we want to do like the whole thing. And then yeah, it was like super stressful. We got there was no electricity in the room. um
Oh no.
all of their speakers had no XLR cables for the microphones. And doing I was in bands for a few years, and
Mhm.
we brought with us like basically everything we would need, because we were like just imagining every worst case scenario that we could.
Yeah.
So we were like able to make it work, but we you know how can you prepare for no electricity?
Yeah, that's
so
insane.
so yeah, it was like, it was pretty stressful preparing for it, but it was a lot of fun. We're planning another one. Location has not been secured yet, but we think it's going to be on Long Island. I think we're going to do one this summer, another one. So
That's sweet. I
yeah,
might have to come check it out.
hey,
That's
hop on
really
the
cool that you
train,
guys were
man.
able to. Yeah, the LIRR. I'll hop on that bad boy.
Yeah.
That's so cool that you guys were able to do that, and I think that really goes towards what we were talking about before, where your show is really building a cool community of like-minded people who, by all accounts, are very nice, very nice to each other, and just want to
Oh
like
yeah.
chat with like-minded people, chat about movies, find a group of friends online, which is like kind of what
Yeah.
we're all looking for. Like, isn't that
It
the
was
point
so
of all of
crazy.
this?
Yeah, one of our patrons drove down from Canada. One of our patrons
Oh
flew
wow,
in from like the DC area. Another one of our patrons took a bus. It was like 2 days on a bus from North Carolina. It was,
Jesus.
yeah, it was like at a certain point we were like, oh no, people are actually coming to this. But it was like the nicest thing to be able to like meet people and hug them and talk to them. And like, we hung out after the show. Like, the movie
Hmm.
theater has like a bar in the lobby. So we hung out for like hours afterwards, just like talking and meeting people that we've only seen like on Twitter and stuff. And
Yeah,
we all went out for breakfast the next day. It was awesome. Like, yeah, really, like it went really, really well. So I highly recommend, man. If you guys are, you know, when we were kids, they said don't meet people you meet on the internet, and now it's like, nah, go ahead and meet them. It's
yeah. Have them fly in, have them
yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're cool.
everything, Amtrak,
Yeah,
whatever it takes. Yeah,
that's right.
there are cool people that you can meet on the internet. I think this is proof of that. Your live show is obviously the ultimate proof of that. So again, movie friends, check them out. You guys are on every
We're
podcasting
everywhere, baby.
platform. Got the Patreon going and everything. Truly, I think if you're listening to the show, you will enjoy Seth's show as well. I do have to apologize for only inviting you on and failing to extend
Oh
the
yeah.
invitation to Michelle as well.
Yeah, well, Michelle, she always says Seth is the movie part and I'm the friends part. So while she would have liked to come on just to talk with you, she is not about, like watching all these extra movies and stuff all the time. So
Yeah.
yeah, she's probably relieved to not.
When I'm doing my friends podcast, not the TV show Friends, but just making friends or whatever, then I'll have Michelle on, and you'll skip out on that one.
There you go. That's right. Yeah, because I hate people.
Yeah. They're the
Yeah, I mean,
worst.
for me, it's like, oh yeah, okay, I got to watch The Outsiders for this thing tomorrow. I was already gonna watch a movie today. Like it's like, who
Yeah.
cares? It doesn't make a difference to me.
Do you watch a movie a day? Is that typically your
Um,
goal, or?
yeah, since starting the show, it's been hard to keep that pace, just because, as recording. Let's say you record for an hour and a half. I'm gonna edit that episode. Even if it was perfect and I didn't make any edits, which has never happened, that's still another hour and a half of my time. So most of the time editing an episode is like 3 hours long. That's a lot of time for one episode. We put out about 3 episodes a week. So
Oh
my
wow.
movie watching has like tanked. The year before,
Yeah.
I watched 1041. That was 2022. And then in 23, I think I ended with like 260 or 300, over 300. I don't know. But I'm trying to be better this year. I'm trying to keep it to one a day.
Yeah, I hear you. It does become a little hard, a little tougher when you're trying to work in, recording time, watching
Yeah.
specific movies, and like watching those movies intently,
Yeah. Yeah.
preparing for the show, and all that stuff. I think that brings us to our movie of the day, our movie of the week, The Outsiders. I'm assuming that this is a personal favorite of yours. When we were sort of chatting back and forth on potential episodes, I know that this movie, sort of stuck out to you, and you're like, oh yeah, I could definitely do The Outsiders.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to talk about this. Like I mentioned on the front end, I had not seen this movie before. I remember very distinctly always looking at it on the bookshelf in my parents' house and never picking it up to read it, but always thinking that might be a book that I want to read at some point. Never read the
Yeah.
book, never watched the movie. So yeah, all that to say, let's jump into the film itself. What is your like overall sort of relationship to The Outsiders? Is this something that you watched earlier on in life? Did you come across it later in life? What's sort of just what's your relationship to this movie?
Yeah. So this was one of the big movies in our house growing up. My parents had 8 children. They had six
Oh wow.
boys in a row and then 2 girls at the end. And so we were very, we weren't like bad, rambunctious boys. We were all pretty well behaved on the nerdier side of reading books, watching movies, listening to music, playing music. We all got into our fair share of like trouble, definitely. But just having a story about a group of boys who make themselves into a found family, and are also kind of on the wrong side of the tracks, or like the wrong side of society. We loved that. We like ate that up. When we were growing up, we were very much into punk music and our local punk and DIY music community. And so oftentimes we found ourselves on the outside of you know nice acceptable society, like the socias. We yeah, we basically were like, we looked like the greasers in this movie. And my parents were born in the 50s, so they were teenagers throughout the 60s and 70s. And so this movie also very much resonated with them. So this was like a family movie growing up, which now watching it,
I love
um,
that.
I I wouldn't say that this is like incredibly risque, but it's got its fair share of like, this is not really a kids movie moments. But
Hmm.
I actually read the book first. I would have read this book probably when I was about 9, because I remember the house that I read it in. So that would have placed me 8 or 9 when I read this book, which is pretty young.
Yeah.
S.E. Hinton wrote this when she was 16 or 17. So it's not the most like dense of
Yeah.
literature. It's pretty easy reading young adult fiction. And so I got it, I understood it, and then, watched the movie, and yeah, I was just in love with it, like obsessed with it. And how she goes out of her way, like, she said she wanted to write this story to show people that like greasers were normal human beings who had lives and feelings and
Yeah.
emotions. And if you made this movie today, you would have people who are like, oh my gosh, they're making this movie like so woke, and they're making these guys so effeminate. They're crying and they're hugging and they're telling each other about their hopes and dreams. This was back in 1983 or 84.
Yeah. 83.
Yeah, 1983, a story about 1965. And so in that regard, like, this movie, along with like Stand By Me, showing men at various ages of adolescence grappling with not just physical forces, not just societal, pressures, money problems, but grappling with their feelings and with their emotions. Oh my gosh. Yeah. This was like the perfect story for me growing up. And for that reason, I think I can be a little more easygoing on this film. I have this film rated at 3.5 on Letterboxd. And despite it being
Okay.
like one of my childhood favorites, I do still have to put on my critical glasses when I think of it,
Yeah.
which I'm sure we'll talk about. But yeah, that's basically, me and the Outsiders.
I love that. Yeah, I love that you and your family used to watch it. I love the dynamic of, you and your brothers, and um where do you fall within that six?
So I'm the last. I'm the youngest boy. So I'm
You're the
number
youngest, so
6. Yep.
you're more of a pony boy Johnny
Yep.
type than
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Did did you identify with those two the most? Like, do your older brothers have similar relationships to this movie? Do they feel about it the same way that you do? Or is it maybe a bit tougher for them because, and sorry if I'm like going too deep into like psychoanalyzing your
Oh,
entire
feel
family
free.
dynamic, but just
Feel
wondering if like
free.
your brothers feel the same way, because I would assume that they would identify more with some of the older characters like Swayze's character or whatever,
Yeah.
who's not in it as much, so maybe it's a little bit harder to like fully connect to the movie the same way that maybe you were.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that because I'm not like an older brother of like a bunch of boys. So like my older brothers, they would maybe feel closer to Soda Pop, or Swayze's character's name is totally evading me because I'm thinking about is Dally.
Yeah, I can't remember his character's name.
But yeah, like I think that Ponyboy is the in into this world because he is the outsider, right? Like,
Hmm.
he's very intelligent. He's a writer. The structure of the whole movie is him writing the story of the Outsiders, right? And we start with
Hmm.
that and then we end with that, and we realize like, whoa, we were listening to his story the whole time. Crazy. But Ponyboy is like the hero. And so I think most people watching this would probably relate more to him in a selfish kind of a way. Daryl. That's why I was thinking of
that's the
Dally.
Swayze character.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
there's Dallas and they call him Dally, and then there's Daryl and they call him Derry.
Yeah, that's too confusing.
Yeah,
All these guys are so famous that I feel like this is one of those movies where you just refer to everyone by the actors' names, with the exception
yeah,
of Ponyboy.
yeah.
And maybe Johnny kind of go back and forth, but Johnny is played by the Karate Kid himself, so
Right. Yeah. It's pretty wild. I mean, C. Thomas Howell, he had roles throughout the 80s. But it's crazy looking at this and saying, like, yeah, out of the main group of greasers, the main character, his actor went on to have like the smallest career.
yeah, which kind of sucks because you can tell in this that he's awesome and
Yeah.
should have had a very promising career. I do wonder, I was looking at his filmography because I was thinking, why is this dude not a bigger name? And I was wondering how much Soul Man maybe had to do with him, with his career not taking off the way that it maybe should have.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if that didn't have something to do with his career falling apart, it probably should have. But yeah, yeah, definitely after, I mean, this is 83, and then Soul Man is 86. And in between that, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 movies in this, so 7 movies in 3 years. That's a ton of work.
Yeah,
After that, it's really starting to drop off into the territory of stuff that like nobody has heard of. So,
yeah,
but here, I mean, he's great. He's very believable as, Ponyboy is 14, just turned 14, and his character is supposed to be, he's a kid. He's like, everyone perceives him as a kid. He's very young. He's
yeah.
smaller. For the second half of the movie, everyone is always concerned about his physical well-being, and rightly so. He ate, rotten bologna sandwiches for several days and then lived through a fire. So kind of makes sense.
It's
Like
tough
Daryl,
conditions.
yeah, Daryl keeps being like, "You don't look good," and I'm like, "Yeah, you don't look good, Pony Boy." I think we should sit this one out. But yeah, these, I mean, this cast it's insane.
Well, yeah, so all right, before we get into some of the, like deeper thematic stuff that you brought up, let's quickly talk about the cast because the cast is absolutely stacked. So we've got C. Thomas Howell as Pony Boy. We've got Ralph Macchio as I feel like I always mispronounce his name. For someone who decided to do podcasting, I have very little faith in the way that I pronounce most things, but that's neither here nor there. So we've got the Karate Kid himself
Yep.
as Johnny. You've got Matt Dillon, Emilio Estevez, Patrick Swayze, Tom Cruise, and Rob Lowe making the rest of the group. And
Yeah. Yeah.
if that's not like a who's who of 80s, heartthrobs, like I don't know what is. Like this is one of the strongest casts that you'll ever get. And I
Yeah.
think what the most amazing thing is that so many, if not all of these guys were just starting their careers. So it's not
Yeah.
like any of them were really stars at this point. Like this is what made them stars.
Almost all of them have like few acting credits prior to this. Adding to the main cast of the Greasers, you also have Diane Lane, who would become Diane Lane, and you have Leif Garrett, who was a huge, like just massive, musician. And out of everyone, he actually has the biggest, like movie career prior to The Outsiders, and he's just Bob. Like he's taken out pretty quickly in the movie. So
Yeah.
like you would never, like, looking back on this movie, you would never think like, oh, who was the big star on this set? Tom Cruise, right? Patrick Swayze? No, it was Leif Garrett. Like, and I think
That's
I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I think it's like Leif Garrett. I don't know. I'm calling him Leif. Who cares?
he's Leaf here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an absolutely insane cast. It's also wild that this was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, and you
Yes.
think of Coppola's career and you think of the highs of it. You're obviously thinking The Godfathers. You're thinking
Yeah.
Apocalypse Now. You might even think of some of his later stuff, but this sort of falls under the radar. But it is it's an interesting entry in his filmography because in a way you can sort of tell that he wasn't totally bought in on this the way that he maybe is bought in on some of his other movies.
Hmm.
But because he's so amazing at the craft of filmmaking, it's, hard for him to make a bad movie. I do think the note at the end of the movie is super interesting about the fact that the only reason he made this is because a librarian and a bunch of, I think, middle or high school students in California wrote him a letter saying, "Hey, this book should be made into a movie, and we think that you should be the guy to
Wow.
to make it." I don't had is that is that in all versions of the movie, or is that only in the? So there are two versions, I guess. There's the complete novel
Yeah.
version, and then there's the theatrical cut. I'm assuming you're more familiar with the theatrical cut, or
Yeah, the
have you seen
theatrical cut.
both? Or
Yeah, that's the one that I grew up with. And so there's a few differences. I watched in preparation for this, I watched the full novel version. Is that the one that you saw?
that's the one that I saw. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, I don't believe that that's at in the theatrical cut.
Do you have a preference in terms of which cut you like better?
Yeah, I mean it's hard to say cuz it's like, you know, which one do I prefer? Which one is better? Like those are two very different things. And it's like, which one is burned into my brain versus which one did I
Mhm.
just watch last night? I think the only thing, and I saw a few other people comment on this, the full novel adds in a lot more music, and not score, just like
Mhm.
pop songs. And in places in the theatrical cut where there was very tense music, here we get like rockabilly, like Elvis stuff, and
Yeah.
it gives it a really really different tone. Like this movie seemed a lot less serious in the new version, but I still loved it. And I think that if someone watched it for the first time, they wouldn't know the difference, and so they it might not bother,
Yeah.
it might not bother them at all.
I had only known that thing about the music in reading up afterwards.
Yeah.
His his dad composed the original score, right?
If that's his dad, yeah. Wow, that's crazy.
That's what's on the wiki, is that his father is the composer of the score, and because it was his dad, he didn't want to turn around and say, "Hey, I don't love the score that you made for my movie." So he just
Yeah.
left it in. And then,
Man.
years later, when he went on to make the full or complete novel version of the movie, he decided, to hell with my father's score.
Sure,
He's dead,
sure.
so I don't have to I
Yeah,
don't
he's
have
probably
to
dead.
confront him, and I can just put in the music that I want to put in.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, I don't know what his experience was working with S.E. Hinton on this, but it's crazy that Coppola makes The Outsiders and then immediately follows that up with S.E. Hinton's Rumblefish, also starring Matt Dillon. And
Hmm.
prior to The Outsiders, Matt Dillon starred in Tex, which is another S.E. Hinton story. And so Coppola does two of her novels back to back,
Yeah,
and Dylan does three starring roles in her of hers in a row. That's crazy. Like,
that's insane. Yeah,
who else has done that? Like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings.
yeah, that's that's it. Yeah, outside of those franchises, no
Yeah.
one's doing that. Quickly on Matt Dillon, I feel like we just have to name a star in terms of who's doing the best acting out of the crew. To me,
Yeah.
it's Dylan. Do you agree, or do you have someone else who you would go with?
Um, I think I and yeah, like hey, if you're listening to this, I apologize if your heart is about to be broken. I love this movie and I love all these actors. These are all very talented actors. There are times where the acting and the dialogue, they're just not meeting in the middle. I think that Matt Dillon is great. I think that he's great in this
Yeah,
movie, but I think that there are also a few not great moments with him. The meme template that's like Dally, you got to stop. Your swag is too different. Your smoke is
Yeah,
too,
your
you know
smoke
that
too
one?
tough. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, they're gonna kill you. That's him in this movie. Like if that meme has ever been about one character,
yeah.
it's about Dallas Winston, and and it's true. Like that's, um, yeah, I love him. He's doing, you know, he's doing a lot. He's doing a lot. Where I feel like C. Thomas Howell and Ralph
Hmm.
Macchio, they're not doing a lot. I feel like Patrick Swayze isn't, it's all a little bit more
Yeah,
reserved and like natural. Even Rob Lowe, there's a lot of hooting and hollering, there's a lot of flipping off of cars and stuff, but
yeah.
Matt Dillon is big. He's big in this. And
Hmm.
so yeah, I mean, I love him. I would say honestly for me, like just in terms of like best acting, I would probably say Patrick Swayze, which is a shame because he's barely in this movie. But I
Yeah,
believe everything. Every He's a complicated character. On the one hand, he's like, you can't leave because you're gonna get thrown to a boys' home. And on the other hand, he's like, all right, you can come to this rumble. You know,
yeah. I love when fights were called rumbles.
yeah.
Such
Oh
a
man,
simpler time in America.
being a kid watching this movie, I was like, I'm gonna be in a rumble one day. Like, thankfully, we took
Yeah,
the path of peace and nonviolence when it came to being punks, but I like there were plenty of times where I was like, dude, I'm gonna beat up this rich kid.
yeah. Such a better time when kids were just out rumbling.
Yeah.
So I I hear what you're saying about Matt Dillon. I do think the one actor in this movie who had a few moments where I thought that they weren't necessarily living up to what some of the other folks were doing. There's a moment towards the end where Rob Lowe has his big moment, and I
Yeah.
felt like he didn't deliver, which sucks because
Yeah.
Rob Lowe is so great.
A lot of Rob Lowe's stuff I saw for the first time watching the full version because a lot of his stuff was cut out of the theatrical version, including that like
Yeah,
big thing at the end, which does
yeah,
feel
of the
like
two of them, like
yeah, it feels like a deviation, right? Like it's like, all right, we're done, kind of, and then it's like, no, no, no,
yeah,
soda pop.
let's give Soda Pop his moment, but he doesn't need it.
Yeah,
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 just be in the background and be a pretty face, Rob Lowe. That's all that we
yeah.
need from you.
I
That's all that
did
we want from
like,
you, and he's great at that.
yeah, I did like soda pop and Ponyboy in bed towards the beginning. And I saw
Mhm.
some people who were like, oh, this is very homoerotic. And I was just like, they're brothers and they're young and their parents
Mhm.
died. And like they live in a constant state of like, am I going to be murdered walking home from the movies?
Yeah,
Like they like cut his neck, man. So I didn't take it that way at all. And I thought it was, like I said, like to make film this back in like 1983, I feel like is pretty astounding. I'm not surprised that they cut this from the theatrical version, but that was the scene that I liked the most because I liked seeing, you know, Soda Pop cares about Ponyboy and he cares about Daryl. Like he cares about both of them, and that's
mhm.
why I think at the end he's like, you're constantly pitting me against you know each
Yeah,
other to choose a side, and I don't want to like he's trying to choose both of them, and they're like, no, it's got to be my way or the other way, and he doesn't want it. He wants them all to be together.
that is a tough, situation that they put him in. I do wanna talk a bit about this sort of just how masculinity is displayed here
Yeah,
because I can see how a lot of folks would take this movie or read this movie as being a little homoerotic, even though I think that's
yeah,
like a totally ridiculous viewing. Just like the idea that young men in uh, the American past could have emotions or have
yeah, yeah,
feelings and express those feelings to people who they're close to was like such a foreign idea that it could only
yeah,
be seen as in some way being, you know, kind of gay.
Right, right,
When
right.
it's just like men have always had emotions, men have always had feelings, men have always needed to express said feelings and emotions to those who are close around them. And this movie is just like a beautiful example of how that can play out. But you can also, at the same time, you can have that sort of rugged masculinity that we're used to from, you know, the westerns or whatever it may be.
Yeah, yeah. They they are doing it all.
Ye-
They're crying, they're reading poetry, they're watching the sunset, and then they are kicking rich kids' butt. Absolutely. Yeah, I understand, like, you know, a lot of things had to be hidden, right, in mainstream
Mhm.
art for decades and decades and decades, right? And so you have things that are queer coded, and then you have things that are not. And I think it's much like you're saying, men have always had emotions, right? We also have to say, well, men have always been gay. We just didn't know about it. But the two do
Yeah.
not have to go hand in hand. Like, you can you can just be open and honest with your friends, like Johnny and Ponyboy out in the country, right?
Mhm.
One of the most devastating parts about Johnny dying, aside from just watching a young man die, right,
Yeah.
is he says, like, when you and I were up there, it was the only time I've been away from the neighborhood, and 16 is too young. Like, there's so much stuff that I haven't done. And like, when they are out in the country together and they're playing cards and reading and cutting each other's hair, and
Mhm.
there doesn't have to be anything sexual about that. And I think if there isn't anything sexual about that, it's almost more admirable, because it's saying, like, no, these dudes are, they're tough fighter crazy dudes,
Mhm.
and they're also full human beings.
The idea that any expression of masculine emotion is somehow inherently like a gay trait is
Yeah,
such an absurd, it's such an absurd leap to be making. And like you're saying, there are so many movies that are, you know, queer coded and about, you know, masculine romantic sort of love. But
yeah,
I think to read The Outsiders as that is to do a disservice to both this movie, this story, and to other stories that are actually about, you know, romantic love between two men.
right,
This is
precisely, yeah,
as
precisely,
as platonic as it gets, and
yeah,
again, it is super important to have representation of those platonic relationships playing out, you know, in a movie like this for
yeah,
young men to see that it's important for those conversations to be had, for those moments to be shared, and like it doesn't matter where you are on the
yeah.
sexuality spectrum.
I mean, it was like I said, like, I read this book when I was 8 or 9, and then I'm watching this movie, and it was huge for me. You know, I mean, luckily I grew up in a home where we were taught it's okay to cry, it's okay to feel, it's okay to talk, like all of those things. So I had that not
Hmm.
just coming from the page and not just from, you know, the television screen, but
Yeah,
it's good to show it's good to show that, you know, emotions are not reserved only for one type of person. So, and
yeah,
I think that that's not something that I thought about as a kid. Like, I didn't think about that at all. I didn't think about that until rewatching it as an adult, and just being like, what a gift this movie is. And that's why I mentioned Stand by Me. You know, in Stand by Me, the
hmm,
kids are, they're younger. They're all in very much, very, very much different place in life than the Greasers
hmm,
in 1965 Oklahoma. You know, but they're still allowed to express themselves. They're allowed to cry. They're allowed to open up to their friends and not be the butt of a joke, not be the wimpy kid crying in the
yeah,
corner, you know, who's like looking for his mom and everyone's making fun of him, right?
yeah. I think so. Last thing I'll say on this topic before we move on is the other thing that I love about how all of that plays out in this movie is that the characters themselves are very understanding of that. There's never a moment where, like you said, a character is made fun of for
No.
crying or for feeling down or for being sad that his parents are drunks or sad that his
Yeah.
parents have died. All of the characters are like extremely supportive of each other in,
Yep.
you know, whatever sort of emotion it is that they're feeling at a particular time.
Yeah. It's great. It's great. I don't know that I can think of another movie that does that to the level that this does.
Yeah. It's like pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of sad that there aren't more movies like
Yeah.
this where we just get to see that. So I think the other big sort of theme in this movie beyond you know, just young male bonds and friendships and all that stuff is the found family.
Yeah.
uh it's hard to watch this and not think of like a P.T. Anderson movie
Sure.
where these guys have really created their own sort of found family within each other. So what did you make of the family dynamic of the group?
Yeah, I mean it's all, I think, something to keep in mind is this isn't this isn't a family born out of necessarily fun and like desire to be around each other. This is a family that's born out of like necessity. These kids are poor. These kids are living on the wrong side of town. These kids are, for the most part, parentless, right? So we know that the three brothers, they have no parents. It is up to them. Johnny's parents, not around. Dally says, my dad doesn't care if I'm dead in a ditch somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Two Bit, I think he says something about his mom doesn't care what he does all day. I don't think that there's evidence that there's anything sinister going on with his parentage, but he doesn't have a job and just wanders around all day. And so his parents might not care
Yeah.
about him either. And so I think that that's, like I said, it's important to keep in mind that this isn't just a friend group. Like they are fighting to survive. And I don't think it's just like, oh, you listen to different music than us. Like the Socs are actively trying to kill
Yeah.
these kids. Like that's how we see it. And like, you know, how are we introduced to them? They're chasing down Ponyboy. They stab him. They slice his neck. If
Mhm.
the other guys hadn't come out, who knows? Then after the drive-in, they're trying to drown Ponyboy. And
Yeah. This is
so,
like beyond just like bullying for being poor.
right, it's not just we're in different friend groups. This isn't Mean Girls, right? So it's not like, oh,
Yeah.
we're together because these three are bullying us and we want to get back. No, like they are fighting for survival. And so in that aspect, their relationships are extremely, trust based. When Johnny says that he wants to turn himself in, Dally is just so betrayed, you know. When they kill
Yeah.
when they kill Bob, they go to Dally. They don't go to the cops. They don't go to the hospital. They don't go. So there's a lot of trust with all of them. And this isn't the first Rumble. How often does a Rumble happen? It's have you seen the original Matrix trilogy?
Only the first one.
Okay, so I won't say that example then, because I'm glad I asked, because that would have been a big spoiler. But it's like, how often are these rumbles happening? Like, is this like
Yeah.
an every 6 month thing? Is this a once a year thing? But
Quarterly.
you get the idea that like there's all of these like microaggressions that turn into scuffles, that turn into really bad things, including people dying.
Mhm.
This Rumble doesn't have weapons, but perhaps previous ones have had weapons. I don't know. And so
Yeah.
it gets to a point where they just need to face off, fight each other, and then whoever loses has to leave the other one alone until the microaggressions start to build up, to the point where they are
Yeah.
at the beginning of the movie. So yeah, anyway, that's my extremely long answer to your question, but I think it is important to keep this in context, that this isn't just a culture that's based out of, like I said, opinions, desire, um, what music you like. This is a culture that's based out of class, warfare.
Yeah, I mean class warfare in the most literal sense, right? Not
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like you were saying, it's not just class warfare in the well, those guys are poor, so we look down on them. There is a serious um there's serious offenses that like the socias make towards the greasers. And I
yeah,
think another thing that's really interesting about watching a movie like this is how sympathetic this story is to the greasers. And I think typically, a movie like this about some guys who were born on the wrong side of the tracks, some guys who have had a rough upbringing, we would have many moments of them acting out, of them being the aggressors in
yeah,
whatever
yeah,
sort of disputes are going on. And that's not the case here.
yeah,
There's never any sort of indication that our group of greasers are doing anything other than just trying to survive.
yeah,
And
yeah,
you know beyond just the heartbreak of not having parents who are able to look out for them, beyond that they also have this group of assholes, in their cable knit sweaters or whatever, coming
mm-hmm,
down or coming up from their side of town to attack them. it,
yeah.
it's it's pretty intense. So I don't know if you have anything more on the sort of class warfare of the movie and of the story.
Well, it's funny, like where their lives like overlap. You know,
Hmm.
Ponyboy and Cherry go to the same school. She doesn't know that he exists, and it is made very clear by her, despite this like very intense, extreme connection between us, not emotionally but
Hmm.
situationally, right? Like your your best
Yeah.
friend murdered my boyfriend, right? So we are tied together. I will testify on your all this different stuff. She's still not going to interact with him in that space where they overlap. When they go to the theater, as movie lovers, we believe that the theater is a sacred space for everybody, right? Every person from every walk of life and class, we all come together and I just listened to an interview with John Carroll Lynch, the actor and director, and he said it
Hmm.
so wonderfully. And maybe someone else has said it before, but I'm going to attribute it to John Carroll Lynch because that's who I heard say it last. He said we all agreed to come together, and for an hour and a half or 2 hours we dreamed the same dream. And so I love that the drive-in scene is shown to have, there's the seats for the people who have cars, and if you don't have a car you
Hmm.
can still pay and get in. You're kind of off to
Yeah.
the side, but yeah, so it's interesting to see like wherever greasers and socials have to overlap, they can't coexist. Like they have their separate places, they have their homes, they have their
Hmm.
neighborhoods, but when they come together, the two cannot exist.
Yeah. It is really interesting that it goes beyond just differences of opinions. It's the literal inability to exist within the same spaces.
Yeah, yeah.
It's tough, man. Do you have like any familiarity with greaser culture, like at large, beyond this movie, or is
Not
most of your
really.
understanding of like who greasers are from The Outsiders?
Yeah, not really. Like my mom grew up in rural Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
And so she would tell us like, yeah, I knew guys who were greasers and usually they were mechanics.
Yeah.
And I think I
Funny
think
how that
like
works.
yeah, like I think somewhere in like Americana there's like the greaser, car guy, rockabilly, maybe a slight crossover into like motorcycle guy thing,
Hmm.
that exists. But no, I mean, I've never been into cars. I've never been into fighting. I had greasy hair, but that was just because I was a young Mexican punk who didn't wash my hair. So
All right. Well, I feel like there aren't a lot of greasers in, the tri-state area. Like we weren't coming across a lot of greasers in
No.
our necks of the woods.
No. Occasionally you would see a guy and you were like, oh, he's really into the 50s. Like he's wearing a white t-shirt and maybe a leather jacket and
Yeah,
boots and stuff. And you're like, all right, man, good for you. You know, that was a long time ago, but you know, who am I to judge?
sweet. Yeah, right on. I did
Yeah,
always
I think,
think that it was cool that like
yeah,
the idea that greasers would put their cigarettes in the and like roll up
sure.
the t-shirt sleeve. But beyond
Sure.
that, I'm not familiar with greasers and their game. I don't know what they
Yeah,
I've like never really known what they do.
I think most people's entry point into that would be Grease or the Fonz from Happy
Yeah,
Days. Yeah.
very different portrayal of
Yes.
greasers than
Yes.
than this movie.
Yes. Very, very different.
Are we ready to say that this is the definitive text about greasers if we're just holding it up against those other two?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I'm not a big fan of Grease the musical. I love musicals, love John Travolta, but Grease, oof, that was a painful experience. I think so. I've never really thought about it like that, and I'm curious now to see. You know, I think pre 70s, you know, American film for youngsters wasn't really taken seriously, right? Like
Hmm.
we had Rebel Without a Cause, which is considered to be like the first teen movie that is, you know, they made it in color because they didn't spend a lot of money on color films unless they thought it was going to be a big deal. Even though color technology was
Hmm.
available, they were still making movies in black and white. So to make a color
Yeah,
film was like, this is a big deal. This is a big movie. People are going to come and see this. And so that's kind of the first time, I think that was 54, Rebel Without a Cause. So that's the first time that it's like, hey, this is a movie about teenagers and it's to be taken seriously and
yeah,
it's telling it like it is. But I would be curious. I'm gonna look into it now. You've sparked like a trip through letterboxed lists in my mind. But yeah, like you know, the '60s, prior to like the American film revolution of the 1970s, the '60s teen stuff is just like you know beach movies and just garbage.
yeah.
Like, ugh.
I mean, that is really interesting when you, especially when you know, to bring it back to The Outsiders, and you think about the '80s, and you think about like John Hughes's work as being
Mm-hmm.
sort of like a watershed moment in terms of making movies about teenagers, about their sensibilities, about their sort of hopes and fears and desires and all of that stuff. And to make it in a serious way, you know, you really think about his movies as doing that. But this movie is sitting there at 1983, a couple years before John Hughes really took off, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, it is doing an interesting thing where it's taking a look back in time, but
Yeah.
it is taking seriously the you know, all of those same emotions and feelings that teenagers have, and really like speaking to a young audience, in this case a young male audience, about the things that they're thinking about, and showing them that, you know, they are seen, they are heard.
Yeah.
This is kind of, in that regard, like kind of a big deal in the sort of history of cinema. I hadn't thought about that,
Yeah.
but that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, I think, like you said, when we think of Coppola, there are some things that we think about, and this is not one of them. And you would never say, oh, Coppola helped kick off the 80s teen craze. But should
Mhm.
we? Perhaps we should.
Like, looking back at it, re-examining things, there's like that argument can certainly be made of
Yeah.
understanding that teen stories, you know, do need to be taken seriously. I also think it's interesting like where this movie sits in history. I feel like the '80s, a lot of it, like Reagan's America, you're doing a lot of looking back at the '50s and
Mhm.
sort of pining for that sort of time in Americana and American life. And, that's when you get like Back to the Future is doing
Yeah.
interesting stuff like with that. And like
Right.
all of Spielberg's like produced films in the 80s are in a way, in that conversation about like things like looking back towards the 50s as like this great time in American
Sure.
history. But then you have something like The Outsiders, and it's looking back, and it's, what is it, late 50s, early 60s. So kind of doing that same sort of look back. It doesn't have the same, rose tinted glasses that those other
Right.
movies have in terms of looking back. Yeah, I don't do you have anything else on that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's why letting marginalized people make films about themselves is so important, right? You can take the greasers and the outsiders and you can put in any people group. Again, this is
Mhm.
specific to Oklahoma in 1965, and like we don't want to take away from that. But whenever people talk about the good old days, it's always like, well, who was it good for? Like it was good for you.
Yeah.
Like you want things to go back to a time when it was good for you. Today now might be the good old days for somebody else, you know?
Mhm.
And if the only movies that we have about the 60s or the 50s are made by affluent white artists, then why are they going out of their way to stretch themselves, philosophically and artistically and spiritually to tell someone else's story where it wasn't that great?
Yeah.
Like what is the incentive that they have there? Money? Like is it a
Mhm.
guarantee that people that they're telling their story are going to come and see it? And that's something that, Hollywood is like still wrestling with, is like who gets to make stories about X people group, who gets to make
Yeah.
stories. And then if we do give someone the reins and we give them the budget, do people come and see it? Is it only for those people? Why is it only for those people? If everybody will come and see The Breakfast Club, which is about, suburban white kids who have a bunch of problems and it's good and it's
Yeah.
universal, why won't you go and see the same story if all of the kids are Asian or if all of the kids are gay or if all the kids are any other people group? Why does that
Mhm.
become specific? And so we're still dealing with, the white male perspective being the default perspective for all of our
Yeah.
story. And it's like, well, no, that's a normal movie. Nobody says, you know,
That The
um,
Outsiders is a white movie.
well, right. And so, like, my whole life, it's like, well, that's a black movie. Well, why is it a black movie? Well, it's made by Tyler Perry and there's a whole black cast. And so you see it and you say, well, that's a black movie. Okay. But then you go and you see Indiana Jones and no one is like, well, that's a white movie. It's a movie,
Yeah.
right? They are,
Mhm.
this is the standard. This is point zero. And then everything else
Mhm.
has to have the label and the title on it. So yeah, I mean, I think that's why, you know, being in touch with world cinema is imperative to understanding not just film as a whole, but your life and other people's lives. Because, you know, we're talking about American films right now, but if you look at what they're making in Mexico in
Mhm.
1980, that's looking back at the 60s, it's going to be a whole different story, or France
Yeah.
or, anywhere in the world. So thankfully, we live in 2024 and we're not limited to what's playing in the theater down the street. We're not limited to just what's in Blockbuster. We have the entire world history of film like at our fingertips most of
Yeah.
the time. And there's nothing stopping us but us saying, I could watch like Los Olvidados, or I could watch Tuki Buki, but I'm gonna watch Thor Ragnarok for the third time.
Third time this week.
Yeah, like it's totally possible. And yeah, you could watch something that feels as outside as The Outsiders, but is
Mhm.
genuinely like made by other people. And I think that's an interest. Like thinking about this, I've never really thought about this in terms of like Rebel Without a Cause, but Nicholas Ray, who made that movie, and then Coppola, who made this one, they didn't set out in their career to be like, we're going to make teen movies. Like, they just
Mhm.
make great films. And that's also why I think more people should be willing to do genre. Like if Steven Spielberg was like, I'm going to make a horror movie, would that not be an incredible horror movie?
Yeah.
I'm dreaming of the day that Wes Anderson makes a horror movie. Be one of the
Oh,
greatest of
wow.
all time. Like people
That'd
should
be
be more
wild.
willing to step outside. And like I'm glad that Coppola was like, hey, these kids wrote me a letter. Sure, I'll make this movie, because he ended up making. I'm not going to say one of the best, but one of my favorite coming of age
Yeah.
movies that's meant more to me than most others like in my life. So yeah, everybody should
We
step
can
outside their comfort zone.
we can call this movie essential. We might not call it the best, but we'll definitely call it an essential movie.
Yeah.
I totally like 1000% agree with everything that you said in terms of, stepping outside of comfort zones, both as folks who are making movies and us as audience members. Like, we really do need to make that effort to watch things that we otherwise wouldn't watch, because you know to bring it back to The Outsiders, yes, this is a movie made by a white guy about white guys, about a time in American history where white guys were just roaming around rumbling with other white guys.
Mm-hmm.
But so many of the themes of this movie are so universal
Mm-hmm.
to audiences from all different backgrounds, both in America and across the country, or across the globe rather. And the same can be said of, like you were saying, movies that have all Asian cast, all gay
Yeah,
cast, all
absolutely.
black cast,
Yeah.
like those same kind of universal truths can be applied to those movies. Like, a movie like The Outsiders has a lot more in common with movies that we would maybe label as like black movies. Like, The Outsiders like has more in common with like Boys in the Hood than it does with like Rebel Without a Cause. Just to
Sure.
to
Yeah.
take two like sort of teen coming of age movies about like what it's like to grow up on the wrong side of the tracks and like feeling like
Yeah.
the whole world is against you. So if you can connect to something like The Outsiders, which I think pretty much everyone can, you can also connect to some of those other movies that you might be putting up barriers for yourself to go out and watch. So
Yeah.
always advocating for, as viewers, we should be expanding our horizons in terms of the movies that we are watching and engaging with, and also just like how we're engaging with movies and engaging with them in emotionally honest ways. It does us nothing but a ton of good. And I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
like that can be said of how uh we both feel about The Outsiders. This is a
Yeah.
movie that, if you approach it from an emotionally dishonest point of view, you're going to come away thinking that it's too melodramatic, or
Yeah.
something like that. Or
Yes.
it's cheesy in its acting and its scripting,
Right.
and in some of
Oh
the
God.
cuts
Oh.
or the ways that like the camera moves.
Ah.
But if you approach it from an emotionally honest way, like, you can walk away from this movie a better person, a more whole
Mm-hmm.
person.
Yeah.
Do you or were you do you have something on the melodramatic piece? Do you?
Oh, it just kills me. Like it kills me when I connect with a movie on a emotional level and I'm able to look past X, Y, and Z, right? And
Mhm.
then, you read on our show, one of the things that we do is we read a half star, 3-star, and 5-star review from Letterboxd for every movie that we do, because we don't want to be sycophantic and we don't want to bear our head in the sand and just say Parasite's the best movie ever.
Mhm.
Like we avoid language. And I think as a just global community of film lovers, best
Mhm.
has to take a back seat to other adjectives.
Yeah.
Because when I say this is the best, right? I'm stating a fact and I'm removing my emotional connection to it so that when you don't
Mhm.
like it, you can't hurt me, right? I'm not putting myself out there.
Mhm.
The movie is the best. And when you don't like it, you're wrong. There's no chance of me being wrong. This is the best movie of all
Mhm.
time. How how can you
Yeah.
refute that, right? And so I think that we need to be more willing to say this movie means a lot to me, and look someone in the
Yeah.
face and say, "Hey, The Outsiders is one of my favorite Coppola films, maybe more than The Godfather," and be willing to look like an idiot and look like maybe you're not the coolest guy, and maybe you don't know the most, or maybe you don't know what's best. And I don't care. I don't care if I know what's best. Just like I don't care, if my wife is the prettiest woman in the room. I don't care. She's mine. I'm willing to stand up for her. I'm willing to stand up for what she means to me without having to say, you're the best. You're the best person I've ever known. You know what I'm saying? Now, obviously, my
Yeah.
wife is the best and the prettiest person in the entire
Of
world.
course.
But,
Obviously.
but when it comes to film and art, I think that we need to be willing to put our heart on our sleeve a little bit more and not try to hide behind the best thing. So, anyway, I started to kind of like lose my mind when you were saying that, not at what you were saying, but because I agree with you, but because when something means so much to you and then you go and read a half-star review and
Mhm.
you see the barriers that they couldn't get through, and you know
Mhm.
that, like, oh, you know you'll never cry at this movie because you thought that the blood in the water when Johnny stabs Bob looks corny or cheap,
Yeah.
or you
You
thought
didn't
that
like
Matt
the cotton
Dillon.
candy sunset. Yeah.
Yeah, which quick little note on that. I don't know if you've seen Gone with the Wind.
I've
You
not.
know, they're talking about Gone with the Wind, right? They're talking about that whole
Mhm.
thing, and Coppola puts this scene, which is I've seen people like they have a hard time with it, but he
Yeah.
is going back to the big matte painting, huge,
Yeah.
shot. That whole Stay Gold, which I don't, it's the heart of the movie. I don't think it's the best scene in the movie, but it's a
Mhm.
huge, huge part. Johnny and Ponyboy are standing there. There's the sunset. There's the light coming on their faces. It looks different from the rest of the film, but in the context of them immersing themselves in this world of Gone with the Wind, and we went and
Mhm.
they mentioned that they went to see the film. It's almost like they have not only left the city, they've not only left the danger, they've like left reality, and they're in
Yeah.
this whole otherworldly plane where they are talking about like art and life and
Mhm.
what it all means, and the cinematography and the lighting in that scene reflects that. I think it's totally on
Absolutely.
purpose.
Yeah.
I don't think it looks bad.
Yeah.
It looks weird.
It's supposed to be jarring, right? It's supposed to not look like the rest of the movie
Yeah, because it's supposed to be
because of
beautiful. Because
yeah, because of where you are, like, on the emotional journey. It's like a
yes,
very,
yes,
it's a very obvious tool that, tool of filmmaking that's being utilized at that very moment in time.
yes. You have a 14-year-old greaser from Oklahoma reciting, Robert Frost to his 16-year-old murderer best friend as they're like on the run. What is that?
Yeah.
What is that? Like, at that point, are we talking about realism, or are we talking about bigger, grander things? And so, yeah, the cinematography reflects that. So, anyway, it just kills me because I love bad movies. Love them. Love
Mhm.
them. Love them to death. I love homemade movies. I love movies that are reaching and just don't quite make it.
Hell
That's like
yeah.
my bread and butter. Like any kind of underdog story, I love it. And that's why
Mhm.
I'm harder on, James Cameron and Steven Spielberg and Christopher
Mhm.
Nolan. Christopher Nolan just came out within the last 2 weeks and said, I'll never make a movie again that doesn't have a huge production budget, because I have access to all of these things. And it would be, I have access to all of this money and all of these resources that filmmakers dream of. And it would be, you know, a shame for me to not utilize them. And I'm just like, dude, I hope that you live a whole happy whole life. But you're going to tell me that at no point in your life are you going to say, this is the story that I want to tell, and it doesn't require $200 million. Get out of here. Come
Yeah.
on. Come on. You're closing yourself off to a whole world. And like, thank God, Coppola, who he never wanted to make The Godfather, right? Lucas convinces him to do it because they didn't make enough money.
Yeah.
And, American Zoetrope is like in debt. And so they're like, all right, just do The Godfather. He's like, okay, fine. Like, he's an artist, and 10-ish years after doing Godfather, The Conversation, and then The Godfather Part 2, like an insane run. 10 years after that, he's like,
run.
yeah, I'll make The
Yeah.
Outsiders. Sure. And it's not technically, like on a technical level, it's not his best movie. It is not the movie that time has remembered, but he was still willing to do it. Anyway, I'm like really going off here, but I think,
no, we love it.
I think it's good to look past the warts and see what the film is trying to do. And yeah, sometimes the thing that's hanging you up, you could just be totally dead wrong about. We're doing Get Out on our show. Nice. And Get Out is a film that I have very famously said I don't really care for. I don't really like. All I see are like tons and tons of plot holes and why this, why that. And then in researching for the show, I found out I'm dead wrong. I was dead wrong about like a bunch of stuff. And all it took was looking into Jordan Peele's intent behind a lot of the things that I thought were like sloppy. And I see, oh my God, this is actually like the tightest screenplay of the last 20 years. It's incredible science fiction, like all of that. So I was wrong.
Yeah, that's really funny.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. That's one of my favorite movies. But again, that's like an extremely like personal text for me. Like,
sure. Yeah.
I watch that movie and I'm like, oh yeah, this is like, I connect with all of this on such a deep level.
Yeah. You might like that episode then.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to listening to that one. Shit. I don't even know how we move on from this. We've gone so far, but okay. So I think sort of what we're both advocating for is, again, this is what we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, is there is so much within online movie culture that approaches the medium from such a cynical point of view. Yeah. And I think the more that we're able to move away from that, the more we'll be able to appreciate the art form in all of its different variations, whether it be, the at-home do-it-yourself project, or if it's The Godfather, or if it's Oppenheimer. We can appreciate all of these different versions of this art form if we just allow ourselves to engage with it in ways that are anti-cynical, because again, we all got into this for a reason. The reason is because we love movies. We all have a movie or movies that, were the first ones or among the first ones to speak to us in really special ways. And I think the more that we remind ourselves of that, the more we're able to find the beauty in whatever movie it is that you're watching. And then you'll be on Letterboxd and everything that you're rating is 3 stars or higher, because you're just like, wow, this is amazing that people did this, and isn't life awesome? And yes, we can always point out the flaws or the shortcomings of whatever movies it is that we're watching. But again, it's all love. Like, we're here to celebrate the art form in all of its different variations. We're here today specifically to,
like I said, you don't have to be sycophantic, and you don't have to lie and say The Outsiders is great. I can point to several parts of this movie that are not great,
Yeah.
but just, humility, right? Humility and criticism and acceptance in other people, and just take cringe out of your vocabulary. You know,
Yeah.
this film starts with like the most earnest. Like, if you want earnestness, watch the opening of The Outsiders. You have Stevie Wonder, who,
Hmm.
talk about a run. Stevie Wonder wins. Let's see, he won Album of the Year. Is it 3 years in a row? He took a year off and then came back and won it. Like 4 times out of five
Legend.
years. It's either 3 times out of 4 years or 4 times out of 5 years.
Either way, just
So
absolutely
just
insane.
right, like one of the top 10 American musicians of all time, and he's singing this song about youth and seizing moments, and it's over, shots like groups of the boys. And if we
Hmm.
look at that as like structure, like what is that? Like, that's strange. It's very emotional, it's very sentimental, right? Like, that's not.
Hmm.
When have you ever seen a movie open with like photographs as if this is like a picture book of the cast?
Yeah. It's
It's
like a yearbook.
very, but it's very emotional, sentimental, very earnest, and
Hmm.
you have to get over it. You have to get over yourself. If it makes you feel icky, it's supposed to. Emotions are
Yeah.
icky.
I
They
I
make
think
you feel
I think
weird.
earnest is such a good word for this movie, and I do think, I think we are coming around as a society to appreciate earnest art a little bit
Yeah.
more than we have in the past. I think the 90s and like early 2000s, we didn't really allow ourselves to be earnest, to
Hmm.
watch earnest movies, to watch earnest TV shows, all that good stuff, listen to earnest music. So I do think a movie like The Outsiders like might actually play well with Gen Z more than it did with most millennials, I would say,
Yeah.
which is kind of a cool thing. So
Yeah.
it would be cool to see a bit of a like resurgence for this movie to grow in popularity again. Like I said at the front of the episode, I hadn't seen this before, but I am happy that I've seen it now. I do understand why my co-writers at Screen Age Wasteland voted this as one of the most essential movies of all time. It definitely deserves its place within this canon.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Seth, thank you again for joining me for this. This has been
Hey, thanks, man.
such an insightful conversation, which I always enjoy. And we had a few laughs along the way,
That's right.
which is always great. Anything else that you have for us? Any more thoughts on The Outsiders before we jump into our recommendations?
You mentioned Gen Z, and I think this is a good experiment. This is a good experiment for being able to hold two things in mind at the same time, which is usually people's big critique of the next
Hmm.
generation. You have Two Bit pulling up girls' skirts at the drive-in. Dally is like literally sexually harassing Cherry. And then later on in
Yeah.
the film, we're supposed to feel for him. And if all we can see are the bad things that people have done, this will be a difficult viewing experience. But if you can look at them and say, they're all doing bad, do I still
Hmm.
feel for them? It's great. It will grow your empathy, it will grow your understanding of other people, because someone being good should not be a prerequisite for us caring for them. Because anyone can be made to be a bad person. So that's kind of my last thought. Like, I don't want to go through this whole conversation and then someone watches the movie and they're like, "What the heck? These guys are like, they do bad stuff, man. They do. It's
Yeah.
they're not, they're not squeaky clean choir boys. They are."
Hmm.
And like I said, I don't want to like dance around it. It is sexual harassment, assaults. It's not good.
Yeah.
thankfully this movie escapes any kind of like racism or anything like that
Yeah.
was, the casual racism that was acceptable like back in the day. It's
Yeah.
mostly
Well,
just
that's easy when
through.
you just like don't have black characters or any
Right,
like
right,
non-white characters, right? Like
right. I was
there's
just gonna
no
say it's through avoidance, really.
yeah.
But I mean, but hey, I mean, even then, people would find opportunities to still make digs or make comments or anything. But
Yeah.
so yeah, so I would encourage you, if you haven't seen the movie, one, why are you listening to this? That's sick. You're sick. You shouldn't do that. But if you haven't, just it's a good thought experiment. It's a good empathy experiment.
Absolutely. Again, Seth, thank you so much for an extremely thoughtful conversation, a very insightful conversation. I feel like we did this movie some justice. I feel like this
Yeah.
movie has done both of us some justice. I hope for our listeners out there, it's done them some justice as well. I hope listening to the two of us go on about this movie, has also been a pleasant experience for all of our listeners out there. Before we get out of here, we got to get to everyone's favorite portion of each episode, our recommendations. So, for any new listeners that we might have out there who aren't familiar with what we do, for each movie that we recommend into the canon, we also recommend 3 things to check out if you like said movie. Those 3 things can be any and everything under the sun. The connections can be as loose or as on the nose as we like. 2 rules, or I guess 3 rules. At least one of them has to be another movie. The other 2 things, they can be anything else. It can be books, TV shows, bands, albums, a painting, a restaurant, anything. For any movies that we recommend, just ask that we don't do any movies that are already in the canon. And we have a strict 3 recommendation limit. So we've had some folks who've come on in the past and they try to do like a 2-for-1 where it's 2 different movies that are kind of related. But uh, unfortunately, we had to serve out some suspensions for all that. So
Got
no
it.
tomfoolery. We run a tight ship over here.
Got
So
it.
Seth, we'll each run through our recommendations, give a brief overview for why we're recommending it. You can kick us off. What is your first recommendation for The Outsiders?
Sure. So I'm going to recommend 3 movies because movies are constantly on my mind. I don't
My
want
kind
to
of guy.
be I don't want to be accused of tomfoolery. So I will just say in a very roundabout way, this movie is based on a book, The Outsiders. But
Nice.
my first recommendation is The Young and the Damned, or Los Olvidados, from 1950, directed by Luis Buñuel. And it's about a group of young criminals. Another movie that I'm going to recommend, and this one, I'm not sure. You can stop me if this one is in your canon. If it's not, it should be, which is
Yeah.
City of God from 2002.
Oh, that actually, I think that might be in. But you know what? That's it's not an obvious choice, so I think we're good to go. I think we're
Sure,
good to go on
sure.
that one. It's not
Yeah.
like,
So,
Coppola
it,
also directed The Godfather.
right. Well, right. Yeah. So if you haven't seen City of God, 2002, Fernando Mireles, it is the Brazilian Godfather, I guess you could say, also about children of all ages and the crimes that they commit as they work their way up in the drug underworld. Amazing movie. If you've been putting it off, if you've heard about it, you've definitely seen the poster. You need to commit and
Yeah.
watch.
I've been putting it off.
You will try to learn nothing about it. If you
Mhm.
can, do it in one sitting. The ending, you'll just be floored. Like yeah,
Yeah, it's been high on
incredible.
my watch list for years.
Yes, incredible movie. And then, not to sound completely pretentious, I will include one other American film, which we already mentioned, which would be Rebel Without a
Mhm.
Cause.
Oh,
Nicholas
nice. I think that might also
Ray's.
be in our canon.
Yeah, well, if it's not, it should be.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, there's a reason that everyone knows the name of this movie, but very few people know what the movie actually is. Um,
Mhm.
James Dean, a teenage performance, or as a teenage character for the
Mhm.
ages, a prototype for the next, I don't know, 40 years of teen
Yeah.
dramas, absolutely essential to the direction of American cinema. And Nicholas Ray is, if you're unfamiliar with him, just read his Wikipedia. It is he's incredibly interesting guy. So those would be my three recommendations or companion pieces for The Outsiders.
I love that. Yeah, dude, Rebel Without a Cause is so good. And I feel like people mostly think of it for the Dean performance, which is obviously amazing, but like the direction of that movie is absolutely bonkers.
Yeah,
Like
it's
that
yeah,
is a
yeah.
very, very, very well directed movie.
I
Like
went into
technically,
it
like
like,
as sound as it gets.
yes, yes. I literally went into it kind of like with my Hun head. Wait, my Hun
Mhm.
head. With my head Hun, because I was like,
Yeah.
fine, I'll finally watch this movie. And I was like, oh my God. Like, this is not, sometimes when you hear a film over and over and over and over again, you're like, how good could this possibly
Mhm.
be? And then you're like, oh, I'm an idiot.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
amazing.
It is that good. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of those movies for sure.
Yeah.
I love that. I love all those picks. I will have to write down the name of the first one because I don't think I'm familiar with it, but
Sure.
definitely want to add that to my watch list. All right, cool. So for my recommendations, I'm going with a really weird theme.
Okay.
I'm going to recommend three movies, and I'm going with three people involved in the making of this film
Okay.
and other works of theirs. I guess the theme will sort of reveal itself as I name the names of these films. So first one that I'm going to go with, this cast is absolutely stacked. We mentioned that Swayze is incredible in this and did not get the burn that he deserved. But a movie where he does get the burn that he deserves is Point Break from 1994.
Yeah.
Him and Keanu, amazing, just
Great.
dude bromance film.
Yeah.
If you like a good bromance, check out Point Break. The second movie that I'm going to go with is another film that stars one of the breakout stars from this flick, and that's going to be Diane Lane. We didn't
Sure.
talk about her nearly enough. She is an absolute legend, an absolute beast, and maybe not her best performance or a movie that she's most
Yeah.
well known for,
Yeah.
but I'm going to recommend Hardball, the great
Oh,
Diane Lane Keanu Reeves movie.
wow. Okay.
So I
Two
think the
Keanu
theme,
connections.
yeah, that's the theme. So I couldn't find or I couldn't think of another person in the cast who had a movie with Keanu, but Francis Ford Coppola, I think 92 or 93, directed Bram Stoker's Dracula, starring
Sure.
Keanu Reeves.
the, the most one of the most miscast roles. Like, oh man, I feel so bad
Yeah,
for
but
him
an
in this.
absolute
But
banger of a
yeah,
film.
yeah, it's
Absolutely amazing.
wild
Yeah,
movie.
up there with some of Coppola's best. So yeah, Point Break, Hardball, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Those are my three picks. Different folks involved with The Outsiders, and of course Keanu Reeves.
Very cool. Very cool.
Seth, thank you again for joining. This has been uh, an absolute blast, a total pleasure. Chatting with you about The Outsiders, about film in general, about movie friends. Listeners, definitely check out the show. Movie Friends is a great pod. You'll enjoy it. Again, you can find it on any podcast platform wherever you wherever you get your shows. Check out Seth and Michelle. They're a ton of fun. They're great people, great show, good times.
Yeah.
Anything else, Seth, before we get out of here?
No, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm glad we could find the time to talk about it. It was like a bit of a lengthy process making it happen because there's been different events, and I had suggested the date of the Super Bowl, not realizing that that is the Super Bowl because I know nothing about sports. But yeah, thank you. This was I had a lot of fun, and sometimes when thoughts live in your mind, you see them differently once you've talked about them. So I was glad to revisit this now, talk about it here with you, and see this movie that I know by heart, see it
Mhm.
in a new light. So thanks. Appreciate that.
I love that. Love that we were able to do that. I'm glad it gave me an excuse to finally watch this movie, starring a young Tom Cruise, my favorite actor, as
Yeah,
problematic as that statement is.
there you go. There you go. Pre teeth Tom.
Yeah, when he still had his messed up teeth.
Yep.
Gotta love it. Great
Yep.
stuff. So we'll be back next week with another episode of the Canon. We're going to be talking about Old Boy, the great revenge flick. So that'll be a ton of a ton of fun. But until then, we'll see you in the wasteland.